My father had been in the ground less than 2 hours when my younger brother started speaking for him. It happened beside the coffee urn at Holland's funeral home while the church ladies were still peeling back the foil on the ham biscuits, and somebody's grandson was dragging a folding chair across the tile floor hard enough to make people wince. Glenn stood near the hallway to the office with a manila folder tucked under his arm, talking low to Mr. Lasker, Dad's lawyer, like they were discussing a roof estimate instead of a man who'd just been buried under damp March dirt. I was holding a styrofoam cup of coffee. I didn't want watching steam rise off it, and I knew something was off before either of them looked my way. Funeral lunches in our county all smell about the same. Weak coffee-baked ham perfume that settled into wool coats and whatever flower arrangement got brought in from the church after the service. Holland's had green carpet in the visitation room and a long table in back lined with crock pots and paper plates. My father, Harold Mercer, had spent 94 years in Pike County and likely would have hated every minute of this part. The soft talk, the little sandwiches, people touching your arm, like grief made you deaf. Dad had been that kind of man. Exact. Sparse. If he said your name, he meant it. If he folded a paper, it stayed folded square. He didn't care for fuss, and he sure as hell didn't care for people reaching into his life before the coffee cooled. That was one of the first things I thought standing there with my black tie half loosened and mud still drying on my shoes from the cemetery. The second thing I thought was that Glenn had his tabs in that folder too neat for a day like this. I could see them from where I stood. Little white labels along the edge. Bank, deed, vehicles, personal. Clean printed letters, same as Glenn always did things. He was 66 and had lived outside Columbus long enough to start looking like a man who belonged in conference rooms. Good coat, good watch. Haircut every 3 weeks, whether it needed it or not. When he came back home, people still saw him first. They always had. I'd stayed. That was the difference between us, or the first one anyway. I'd worked county roads 32 years, then did small engine repair and fence jobs after retirement, and for the last 5 years I'd spent more mornings than not out at Dad's place, checking his pills, taking him to the clinic in Waverly, replacing light bulbs he could no longer reach, pretending not to notice when he needed the same story told twice. Not because anybody appointed me. I was just there. That had a way of becoming your job. Nobody thanked you much for the jobs that grew out of being there. Walter. I looked up. It was my niece Jenna Glenn's girl holding a tray of deviled eggs in both hands. You want me to fix you a plate? I'm all right. She gave me the kind of look younger women give men my age when they know good and well we're not all right, and also know we're going to say it anyway. Then she glanced toward her father by the hallway. Uncle Glenn's talking to Mr. Lasker about paperwork, she said. I can see that. She shifted the tray. Dad said there are some things that need moving quick. I nodded once like that made sense. Maybe she heard something in my silence because she gave a little shrug and moved on toward the food table. That was Glenn's way. Things always needed moving quick when he was the one doing the moving. I set my coffee down on the windowsill beside a paper napkin dispenser and walked toward the hallway. Not fast. Fast makes a man look rattled. I'd learned that young, though I couldn't tell you from which year exactly. Somewhere between being the son who hauled feed sacks and the son people asked to park cars at family reunions while Glenn got asked about his work. Mr. Lasker saw me first. He was maybe 80. Pink scalp shining through white hair, one hand on the folder Glenn had opened halfway. Walter, he said in the same tone a dentist uses before telling you a tooth's got to go. Glenn turned and his face arranged itself into concern so quick it might have been habit more than choice. There you are, he said. I was just telling Ed we ought to wait a day or two before dragging you into all this. Dragging me into all this. I looked at the folder. All what estate things. Glenn gave a small sigh. Not impatient exactly, more like I was making him say something unfortunate out loud. Dad kept it pretty simple near the end. Near the end. Another phrase I didn't care for. Mr. Lasker cleared his throat. Nothing formal today, Walter. Your brother's only trying to make sure the court contact information is in order. My brother, I said, or both of us. There was a beat there. Not long, just long enough to feel. Glenn smiled. He had always known how to smile through a correction. Well, somebody has to field the first calls, he said. No sense duplicating things. I looked at him, then at Mr. Lasker. I was with Dad most every day. Glenn's smile thinned barely. And nobody's disputing that. The way he said it made it sound like I'd claimed a war medal. Mr. Lasker adjusted his glasses. Walter, the court usually appreciates one designated point of contact at the beginning. Who designated it? Neither one answered straight off. Out in the reception room, somebody laughed too loud at something that wasn't funny the way folks do when there's cold cuts and death in the same building. I could smell onion dip. The funeral home furnace clicked on, sending a draft down the hall. Glenn rested his fingertips on my elbow, light as dust. Not here, he said quietly. Come on. Eat something. I moved my arm before he could guide me anywhere. I asked a question that got Mr. Lasker's eyes down onto the folder. Glenn kept his voice level. Dad told me he wanted things kept straightforward. No confusion, no hurt feelings. I nearly laughed at that, though there was nothing funny in it. My father had not gone soft in his 90s. He was slower, thinner, harder to lift from a chair. But he was not a man who talked about hurt feelings as an estate strategy. You say that like I wasn't there, I said. Glenn gave me the patient look. Walter, this isn't the time. That sentence had followed me most of my adult life. Not the time, not the place. Let it go. Don't make something out of it. Glenn never had to say much more than that. Men like him depended on other people's reluctance to be difficult. I stepped back before I did anything dumb like reach for the folder. All right, I said. Then later. Later, Glenn said. And he meant never if he could help it. I went back into the reception room, but it didn't feel the same anymore. The room had tilted in a way probably nobody else could see. Mrs. Blevins from church pressed 2 ham biscuits into my hands. Old Ray Collins from Dad's VFW days told me Harold had been one of the stubbornest bastards God ever made, and I said, yes, sir, that's right. I stood where people expected me to stand and nodded when nodding was needed. But my eyes kept finding that folder. Ruth came over after a while. Glenn's wife carrying a paper cup and a wad of napkins she didn't seem to know what to do with. Ruth had always been careful in the way some women are careful after years married to men who smooth over rooms for a living. You doing okay, Walter? She asked. I'm standing up. She gave a little breath through her nose at that, almost a laugh. Almost not. Glenn's just trying to help, she said, but there wasn't much weight behind it. Mm-hmm. He gets like this with paperwork. Seems to. Her fingers kept folding the napkins smaller. It's been a long day. That was true enough. I let it sit there between us. Then she touched my sleeve once and drifted back toward the casserole table. By the time I got outside, the sky had gone the color of dirty wool. Dad's old Ford pickup was still parked along the curb where I'd left it mud on the Wheelwell's feed store sticker fading in the rear window. I stood there a minute with the funeral home door at my back and thought about the last Tuesday I'd spent with him. He'd been at the kitchen table in his brown cardigan sorting mail into little stacks. Glenn had come by in one of his city coats with 2 envelopes and a pen. I'd walked in from the shed and Dad had covered one paper with his hand so quick it struck me even then. Later, he'd said. I hadn't asked. That bothered me now. 3 days after the funeral, we were down at the county probate office in Waverly. The courthouse had that old limestone smell to it, part dust and part mop water, and the radiator under the front window hissed like it had a personal complaint. Glenn was in a navy suit. I wore the same dark sport coat I kept for funerals and church Christmas Eve. There were 3 plastic chairs against the wall outside the clerk's window, and Glenn had taken the center one with the folder on his lap like a preacher holding a Bible. I stayed standing. When the clerk slid the preliminary estate contact sheet back under the glass for confirmation, Glenn picked up the pen before I'd even stepped closer. I could see the top half plain enough. Estate of Harold Dean Mercer. Primary family contact, Glenn R. Mercer. Nothing under that. I leaned in. That all Glenn didn't look up. It's just for initial communication. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with red readers hanging on a chain, glanced at me, then at him. Are you Mr. Mercer as well? His brother Glenn said. I said, his older brother. She nodded, but her eyes went back to Glenn. All right, we may need additional signatures depending on whether the supplemental filing affects distribution. I turned toward her. Supplemental what? Her forehead pinched a little. The supplemental filing. It's attached in the estate record. Sealed, looks like. I looked at Glenn. He was still holding the pen, but for the first time all week he didn't seem to know exactly what to say. He was still holding the pen, but for the first time all week he didn't seem to know exactly what to say. Supplemental filing, I said again. The clerk looked from him to me, then back to the computer screen. Yes, sir. It's marked sealed. I only saw the notation when I opened the estate record. She clicked once with her mouse. Filed 11 days before death. 11 days. Glenn set the pen down, careful, as a man laying out a knife he didn't want noticed. That may just be an administrative attachment, he said. Dad's attorney handled a few things near the end. The clerk gave him a polite little shrug that meant she wasn't about to argue but wasn't confirming him either. Could be. Judge would have to say. I kept my eyes on Glenn. You know about it. He met my look and did what he'd always done best. He made my question sound smaller than the room. Walter, I know there were drafts of things. Your father changed his mind more than once. That landed wrong at once. Dad had changed tractor belts, fence wire, and oil filters more than once. He had not changed his mind more than once where important papers were concerned. He kept one coffee can in the pantry for receipts, one drawer in the sideboard for deeds and tax bills, one cigar box in the hall closet for titles and insurance cards. Every sheet had its place. The last 5 years I'd seen him fumble with his knees, his balance, his hearing some. I had never seen him turn careless with paper. Harold wasn't sloppy, I said. Glenn smiled without warmth. Nobody said he was. The clerk slid the sheet a few inches back toward Glenn, but not all the way. If there's a sealed supplemental matter, she said, I can't finalize contact assumptions until the judge confirms whether it affects standing. Standing, Glenn repeated like the word offended him mildly. I leaned closer to the glass. My standing. Possibly any interested parties, she said. I'm not authorized to open it. Interested party. It is something to live. 71 years on the same ground your father walked, carry his groceries, change the battery in his truck twice in one winter because he wouldn't admit he'd left the dome light on. Sit with him through chest x-rays and blood pressure checks. And nights when he could not quite catch his breath and then hear a county clerk refer to you as an interested party. Not her fault. That didn't change the feel of it. Glenn stood. All right, he said, clipping the tone short now. Then we'll wait for the judge. No need to make this harder than it is. He turned like the matter had been managed. I didn't move. When were you planning to tell me? I asked. The clerk lowered her eyes. Glenn buttoned his jacket. Tell you what, that there was another filing. He let out a breath through his nose. Walter, for God's sake, I didn't know what it was. You didn't say there was one, because it may be nothing. I could feel the old thing in me trying to settle back down, same as it always had. Don't press, don't make people stare. Don't stand in a public building sounding like a sore old man. There is a kind of training a family gives you without ever naming it. By the time you're grown, you carry it in your bones and call it temperament. I said, you told me Dad left me nothing. Glenn's eyes flicked toward the clerk, annoyed now that we had an audience. I told you what I understood. No, I said. You told me like it was settled. He stepped closer. voice dropping. Because it probably is. That word probably did more for me than anything else he'd said all morning. Probably was not a mistake. Probably was a man trying to stand on a floor he suddenly wasn't sure was nailed down. The clerk cleared her throat. "Gentlemen, if you'd like to wait, Judge Markham is finishing another matter. She may be able to advise next steps once she reviews the file notation." Glenn smiled at her again, smooth as fresh paint. "Of course." Then he took my elbow. Not hard, not rough, just the same soft public little steering touch he'd used at the funeral home, the kind that says to the room he's upset I'm handling him. I pulled free before he got half a grip. "I can walk on my own," I said. The clerk looked at her monitor. Glenn's face stayed arranged, but the blood rose high in his cheeks. "Then, do that," he said. We went to the chairs by the wall. He sat. I stayed standing another moment, then took the chair farthest from him. The radiator clanked once. Somewhere down the hall, a copier started up, then stopped. Two women came out of another office, speaking in low voices about an uncle and a farm lease. Courthouses are full of lives being reduced to folders. Glenn put the manila file flat on his knees. His wedding band flashed when he folded his hands over it. He stared ahead as if silence would put him back in charge. I looked at the folder tabs again. Bank, deed, vehicles, personal. No maybe about those. No confusion there. He had expected to walk in, confirm his place, and walk out with the county seeing him the way the family always had. I thought of Dad's kitchen table. Oilcloth top, one corner burned dark from a skillet my mother had set down too quick in 1968. The place where I used to find him each morning with his toast and half a banana and the radio low enough you had to lean to catch the farm report. I'd sat across from him 100 times in the last year, sometimes saying next to nothing while he sorted pills into that plastic tray marked with days of the week. Glenn had started coming more often late last fall. Not all the time, just enough to matter. He would sweep in around 10:30 with bakery donuts from Chillicothe. Or a thermal mug from some chain place off the highway kissed Dad on the temple like he was a campaign stop, then lay papers on the table with that same careful spread he used now. Just planning ahead, he'd say. Dad never liked signing things in front of people. He'd always been private that way. If a man from the propane company brought a delivery receipt, Dad waited till the truck pulled off before taking out a pen. But with Glenn there, I remembered now, something in him had gone tight. Not frightened exactly. More like a fence wire drawn too hard. One Tuesday in January, I'd come in from splitting kindling and found an envelope face down by Dad's coffee cup. Glenn was standing at the sink rinsing his hands. Dad had one palm over the envelope, same as a man covering a card game. "What's that?" I'd asked. "Later," Dad said. Just that. But his voice had had edge in it. I should have asked then. The thought hit me so hard it almost felt like shame. Maybe because it was. There is no clean pride in being the son who stays. If staying teaches you to ignore what's uncomfortable just to keep the house quiet. Glenn spoke without looking at me. "You're making this into more than it is." I let the silence sit long enough to mean something. "Am I?" "Yes." He crossed one knee over the other. Dad was old Walt. Things changed quickly. Mr. Lasker and I were trying to keep it orderly. There it was, not Walter now. Walt, the smaller version, the one used when we were kids, and he wanted to get me laughing or let me know he thought I was overreacting. I kept my voice flat. "You and Mr. Lasker." He turned then. "Because you were helping around the place." "That's different." "Helping around the place." For a second, the hallway, the chairs, the courthouse smell, all of it, pulled thin around that phrase. Helping around the place. Like the drives to the clinic, the wet sheets after a bad night, the trips to the pharmacy in sleet, the winter mornings warming the truck so Dad wouldn't have to climb into a cold cab. The stack of unpaid electric bills I'd sorted while he slept in his chair, all of it was nothing but neighbor work. Casual, replaceable. The sort of thing a decent man might do if he had an hour to spare. I looked at him and saw, not for the first time but the clearest yet, that Glenn had not merely expected more than me. He had built a life around believing I was made for less. Ruth came up the hall, then slower than usual, purse tucked under one arm. She must have come in after parking because she still had her coat on. She looked from Glenn to me and knew at once the air had changed. "Everything all right?" she asked. Glenn answered before I could. "Fine." Ruth's fingers worried the clasp on her purse. "Jenna called. She said there might be some delay." "Small one," Glenn said. Ruth looked at me. "Walter," I said. "There's a sealed filing." Glenn forgot to mention her face did something small and quick. Not surprise. Worse than surprise. Recognition trying not to become expression. Glenn stood so suddenly the folder slipped against his knee. "That's enough." Ruth dropped her eyes. That was all. But it was enough to make the back of my neck go cold. Judge Markham's door opened at the far end of the corridor. A bailiff stepped out with a yellow file in his hand, looked toward the clerk's window, then back inside. A moment later, the clerk's voice carried through the opening. "Mercer Estate, Judge will see you now, and bring the sealed supplemental file forward." We followed the bailiff into Judge Markham's chambers, Glenn first, then Ruth, then me. The room was smaller than I expected. No high drama to it. Just a broad desk, 2 flags in the corner, a framed county map on one wall, and a long window looking out over the courthouse parking lot where the March light had gone pale and thin. There was a rectangular table in the middle with 4 chairs on our side, and one on the other where Judge Markham sat with her reading glasses low on her nose and a yellow legal pad turned square to her hand. The sealed file lay to her right. Even before she touched it, I knew it was different from the rest. Brown envelope, court stamp, Harold D. Mercer typed neat across the front, and under that, in a line I could read from where I sat. To be opened only upon dispute, omission, or exclusion affecting my eldest son. I did not look at Glenn right away. I didn't have to. The room had changed shape around that sentence. Judge Markham glanced up at us. "Sit down." We did. Chairs scraped softly across the floor. Glenn's cough sounded too loud in the room. Ruth took out a tissue and twisted it once, then held still. Judge Markham opened the regular estate file first and turned a few pages. "Mr. Glenn Mercer, she said you were presented this morning as the primary family contact and practical representative of the estate." "That's correct, Your Honor." "By whom?" Glenn hesitated just enough to show it. "That was my understanding with counsel." Judge Markham nodded once without agreeing to anything. Then she rested her hand on the sealed envelope. "This supplemental filing was submitted to the court 11 days before Harold Mercer's death. It was properly executed, witnessed, and lodged under restricted instruction. The conditions named on the face of the filing have now been met." No one said a word. She slid a letter opener under the flap and opened it cleanly. There was something about the sound of paper parting in that quiet room that I expect I'll hear the rest of my life. Inside was a typed document, clipped to a second set of estate directives. Judge Markham removed her glasses, wiped one lens with a cloth, and put them back on. When she spoke again, her voice had changed just enough to let the room know she understood the weight of what she held. "This begins with a statement from Harold Dean Mercer." My hands were flat on the table. I became aware of the grain of the wood against my palms, every little raised line in it. She started reading. "I, Harold Dean Mercer, being of sound mind and acting without pressure, submit this supplement because I have reason to believe my intentions may be narrowed or misrepresented after my death. My younger son Glenn has pressed me several times in recent months to simplify my affairs in a way that does not reflect my judgment. My elder son Walter is not a man who argues for himself. That has always been both his weakness and his decency." The room went still in a way I had never known a room could. Not silent, exactly. I could still hear the radiator tap once, and somewhere outside a truck shifted gears on Main Street. But inside me something stopped moving. Judge Markham kept reading. Walter has been the one carrying the daily burdens of my old age. He has taken me to appointments, kept my medicines in order, maintained this property, and spared me the humiliation of asking for help more times than I can count. Glenn has his own strengths, but he has mistaken Polish for judgment in this matter, and he has spoken too confidently about what should happen once I am gone. I closed my eyes for 1 second, no more than that. My father had never said things plain if he thought a man could infer them. He had lived like that, worked like that, loved like that too, apparently. And now, with a county judge reading from a sealed paper, he was speaking straighter than he ever had across the kitchen table. Judge Markham turned the page. I am making this supplement because I do not trust that Walter will protect his own standing if he is told to step aside for the sake of keeping peace. He has done that too often in this family already. Across from me, Glenn shifted in his chair. I opened my eyes then and looked at him. He was staring at the table, one hand at his cuff, rubbing it smooth, though there wasn't a wrinkle in it. Judge Markham continued reading the practical terms after that. Dad had not left me nothing, not even close. The acreage with the workshop and the house itself were to pass jointly in structure, but operational control of the property, the workshop equipment, and the truck were assigned to me. There was language in there about preservation, about stewardship, about not forcing sale without my written agreement. It was Dad's way, I realized then, of doing with paper what he had never managed to do with words when he was alive. He had not just remembered me. He had guarded me. Then came the last paragraph. If this paper is being read because Walter has been told he was left out, then let the record show that such a statement is false and more than false. It would be an insult to truth and to the years of work and loyalty that made my last years bearable. Judge Markham lowered the pages. Nobody moved. Finally, she looked at Glenn. Do you wish to say anything before I enter these supplemental directives? As controlling. Glenn cleared his throat. Your Honor, my father was very old. The last few weeks were difficult. There may have been confusion about Judge Markham raised one hand not sharply but enough. This supplement includes a physician attestation of competency from the date of execution along with witness notarization and direct court lodging. There will be no argument from confusion unless you are prepared to allege fraud. Glenn went red high across the cheekbones. I'm not alleging fraud. No, she said. I did not think you were. That was the first good moment, not the best one, but the first. Watching the same confidence he had worn all week lose its shine under plain facts. Ruth made a soft sound beside him. Not quite a sigh, not quite grief, more like the breath leaving a person who had been bracing for a crash and just saw it happen. Judge Markham signed 2 pages, then slid copies toward us. The estate will proceed under the supplemented directives. Mr. Walter Mercer is to be recognized as a primary interested heir and controlling party in the matters specified. The earlier contact assumptions are superseded. Primary interested heir. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. But after hearing just here because he wanted to be, it landed in me like something being set right with a wrench. Glenn turned to me then. He was trying to gather himself back into the shape he preferred, but it was too late. Once a room sees a man lose his footing, it never quite sees him the same again. Walter, he said, careful now. I never said you didn't matter. I looked at him, really looked. My younger brother, 66 years old, good shoes. Good coat, still trying to manage the air after the truth had already chosen sides. You told me Dad left me nothing, I said. I told you what I understood. No, my voice did not rise. It didn't need to. You told me before the room could hear from him. He opened his mouth maybe to soften it again, maybe to drag us back toward a version of things he could live inside. I didn't let him. You didn't just try to take the land, I said. You tried to decide what I had been worth in his life. That did it. Not because it was loud. Because it was the first time I had ever said the whole thing aloud, where somebody else had to hear it and call it by its name. Ruth bowed her head. Judge Markham looked down at her papers, giving the dignity of not staring. Glenn sat there with his jaw working once, and then not at all. There was nothing left in the room for him to manage. I stood up. My knees felt old and solid at the same time. "Your Honor." I said, "That's all I need." She nodded. "Mr. Mercer." Outside the courthouse, air felt colder than it had an hour before. The light had shifted west, and the long side of Dad's old Ford pickup was holding a little of the afternoon sun. People came and went on the sidewalk. A woman in a denim jacket carried a sack from the bakery down the block. Somewhere a church bell struck 3. Ordinary town sounds. Nothing in the world announcing that a lifetime had just tilted. I walked to the truck and put my hand on the hood. Warm. That was the thing that got me more than the judge, more than Glenn's face, more than the papers in my coat pocket. The warmth still sitting there in the metal like it had been waiting for me. Dad had driven that truck until last summer, right up till his knee gave him too much trouble to trust the brake pedal on the hill by the feed store. I had started it for him after that just to keep the battery alive. Once a week, whether it needed it or not. Let it idle a little. Listen to the engine settle. I stood there with my palm flat on the hood and thought about all the years I had mistaken silence for indifference. All the times I had gone home from his kitchen thinking a job done was the whole of it. All the times I had let Glenn's easy voice tell me what mattered because I was too tired, too proud, or too trained to argue. The papers in my pocket said what they said. The court had done its part. Glenn would have to live with his own face now, and I no longer had to carry the one he had tried to hand me. That felt good. Better than good. It felt clean. But it wasn't free. A man doesn't walk out of a room like that with a brother still intact. Whatever soft hope I had been holding on to these past few days, that grief might sand something down between us, that we might stand in the same patch of loss and at least be honest men in it, was gone. Dad had seen me, yes. But he had seen enough to know he needed a sealed file and a judge to say it after he was dead. That truth had weight. I left my hand where it was a moment longer. The engine underneath ticked once, then again, the way hot metal does when the day begins to cool. It was such a small sound. I had heard it hundreds of times, but standing there in the courthouse lot with March light on the windshield and my father's name still fresh in the court record, it sounded different. Not lonely, not exactly. More like an old thing settling into the shape it had been meant for all along. For the first time in my life, I understood that my father had seen me clearly the whole way through.